Welcome, everybody. My name's Jim Rebitzer. I'm a health economist and professor of management here at BU's Questrom School of Business. It's my pleasure to introduce today Professor Daron Acemoğlu as this year's plenary speaker. In my view, Daron is the most interesting and important economic theorist of his generation. And I'm not alone in this opinion, as witnessed by his many elite positions and awards. Daron is the Elizabeth and James Killian Professor of Economics at MIT and an editor of Econometrica, as well as the NBER Macroeconomics Annual. He is a fellow of the National Academy of Sciences, the Turkish Academy of Sciences, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the Econometric Society, the European Economic Association, and the Society of Labor Economists. Daron has won lots of prestigious prizes and awards. He's won the Schultz Prize from the University of Chicago, the Sherwin-Rosen Prize for contributions to labor economics, the Distinguished Science Award from the Turkish Sciences Association, the John von Neumann Award from Recep College of Budapest. That's not pronounced right. Forgive me if there are Hungarians in the audience. The John Bates Clark Medal, which is awarded every other year to the best economist in the U.S. under age 40, and the Erwin Plein Nemmers Prize, awarded every 2 years for work in economics of lasting significance. He's also got honorary doctorate degrees from all over the planet. As a theorist, Daron has made noteworthy contributions to many, many areas, including macroeconomics, labor economics, the economics of innovation, development and growth economics, and the economic theory of networks. And that is not a complete list. Nowhere near. But what makes Daron an exceptionally interesting theorist is that he's not just a theorist. He is intensely interested in empirical work and has made important empirical contributions in many of the areas in which he's made his theoretical contributions. And in addition, and especially relevant for this crowd, he's done important empirical work in health economics. Daron is not simply a brilliant technical economist. He is also an influential public intellectual, and he has written significant books and papers, as well as powerfully persuasive essays on the political economy of inclusive institutions and the promotion of democratic values. His talk today combines his interests in democracy, in economic growth, and in health, and seems exceptionally timely as well. Please welcome Daron Acemoğlu.
It's my great pleasure to be here. I welcome you to Boston, and I want to thank Jim for that very flattering introduction. As the saying goes, you know, I wish my parents were here, and my father would have enjoyed it, and my mother might have even believed it. So, I'm going to talk about democracy, prosperity, and health, and I have two objectives in this talk. One of them is to talk about the implications of democracy for economic growth, because as I'm going to touch on that, it's a widely contentious issue, and I think one where views have run quite a bit ahead of evidence. So I think it's good to sort of shed some light on that. But also, I want to plant the idea in the minds of professionals here who worry much more and know much more about health than I do, that democratic institutions, and more generally, institutional features and political economy are very important dimensions of the health of a nation, of an area, of a generation that are sometimes ignored, but I think can be fruitfully exploited both for policy and academic reasons. So without further ado, let me jump into the talk, but I want to also say, perhaps before I do that, that what I'm going to report here is based on joint work with Suresh Naidu, who is at Columbia, Pascual Restrepo, who is at BU, just moved to BU, and James Robinson, who's at Chicago. So, of course, any talk about democracy today cannot start without noting what a pitiful state democratic institutions are around the world. They are under attack for a variety of reasons. You know, in places that people thought were the bastion of democracy, such as the United States and parts of Western Europe, authoritarian politics, populism are. Is it not easy? It's flickering, or it's a little fuzzy. I don't know whether they can do anything about that from. I don't think I have any control on that from here, but hopefully when the numbers come, they're going to be more visible, or they can try to fix it from above. So, and in many other parts of the world, which had previously experienced increases in democratic governance, such as Turkey or the Philippines, democratic institutions are under attack or have totally caved in under pressure from authoritarian leaders. There are also other international currents. You know, Russia and China are very important global players, both economically and geopolitically. And one of the sort of driving forces for their foreign policy is to sort of stop the emergence of more democratic governments around their areas, or perhaps even beyond, as exemplified, for example, by Russian meddling in elections in the United States or France. And also, you know, some of these countries have done reasonably well. China has been the fastest growing country over the last 20 years. Russian economy did well for periods of time, and many people, based on this, especially in the aftermath of the financial crisis, which witnessed a lot of hand-wringing in the Western countries in response to the policy imperatives. They also witnessed rapid policy action in China, and the view that perhaps democratic governance is a barrier to good policy adoption, certainly during certain periods, has become more popular, and the number of editorials in the pages of Wall Street Journal or New York Times bemoaning democratic policymaking and putting it in sort of negative light compared to less democratic governments increased quite markedly over the last 10 years. In fact, in academia, the view is also somewhat confusing. For instance, Barrow, summarizing his own research and the research that took place in the early 1990s, concluded categorically that more political rights do not have an effect on growth. The first lesson is that democracy is not a key to economic growth. In fact, his own estimates, he suggested, were somewhat negative, suggesting that democracy, if anything, is not a good thing for economic growth. Gehring et al., summarizing the next 10 years of the large literature in political science and economics, said the net effect of democracy on growth performance cross-nationally over the last 5 decades is negative or null. So I think on the basis of this, many academics who are not experts and some who are experts and policymakers generally view that democracy does not have a major effect on growth, or if anything, perhaps it's a set of shackles on our ankles when we're trying to make important policy decisions. And this is very important because if the second half of the 20th century has been characterized one global trend, much more than the economic globalization, it's the spread of democracy. Only about 30% of countries were democratic in 1960. That doubled by 2000. So is this just a sideshow for economics or for other things, for health? This is what I want to talk about. So what I'm going to claim is that all of that, what I said in the previous slide, is wrong. There is actually a very robust and very significant positive effect of growth, of democracy on growth and on healthcare. On health conditions. So in particular, if a country democratizes, I'm going to try to convince you that in the following 25 years, it's going to have about a 20% higher GDP per capita, and it's going to have about 23, 24% better health outcomes on the one dimension that I can measure fairly well and is relevant for high frequency changes, which is child mortality, mortality between the ages of 0 to 5. As I said, the literature is very mixed. This is not inconsistent with some papers in the literature. I listed a few of them, but it's very inconsistent with several others. So one of the things that I'm going to try to sort of convince you is that there is a systematic reason, beyond ideology, there's an econometric reason for why many, many, many papers have gotten this wrong. And here it is. This is the raw data, and I think, does it look a little clearer? Just about, okay. And what I'm doing here is using annual data, I'm showing the evolution of GDP per capita in a country that democratizes relative to other non-democracies. And in this figure, as in most of what I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to just classify countries into a 0-1 dichotomous measure of democracy, non-democracy, and I'll explain why we do that in a second. So there are two things that are very interesting in this figure. This is just the raw data. There's nothing here other than normalize the year of democratization for every country and then plot the GDP per capita of that country relative to non-democracies in the same year. And then, roll the window. So the first one is that you can see very clearly that following the 0, which is at the bottom there, countries that democratize increase their GDP per capita for the next 25 years or so. The end of the sample after 25 years is pretty noisy, so don't pay much attention to that. And at the end of about 20, 25 years, this translates into a 20% increase in GDP per capita. In fact, we're going to see that whatever you do to the data in terms of regression, IV, various different econometric strategies, that 20% is going to remain. So that's it's raw, and it's in the raw data, and it's very robust. But there's one other interesting thing, and a very big complicating factor, which is that if you look at the countries that democratize 5 years below democracy, so look at the -5 to 0, you'll see that they're actually shrinking relative to other countries. So that's a bit of a problem if you just wanted to do causal type inference here, because countries that are democratizing are not identical to non-democratizers. Something else is going on for these countries. But it also means that many of the strategies that the literature used for the last 30 years are going to just get things spectacularly wrong. So in particular, two things are very common in the literature, with some exceptions, but very common in the literature. The first one is the literature typically doesn't use annual data and takes, this is something that Barrow and some other people before Barrow had done, takes 5-year data or 5-year averages. But if you do that and you have, oops, what happened there? My figure went. Okay, I presume it will come back. Oh, okay. If you do that around 0, you'll be mixing the negatives and the positives. So that's just going to make things really awful. The second thing is, even if you don't do that, even if you use annual data, clearly there are complex dynamics here. So if you don't deal with those dynamics, at least at some simple level, you're going to get estimates that are all over the place, and I'll actually show you that. So in some sense, it's not just that some people were ideologically decided that democracy is not good for growth. It's just that econometrically, if you were not careful, you were going to get things wrong. All right. And this is the same thing for child mortality. It's actually pretty similar to what's going on with GDP. Child mortality increases before a country democratizes, and then thereafter it falls here. with child mortality, I think the picture is a little bit more complicated because it's a more slowly moving variable. There are other things going on. So when we deal with models that look at child mortality, we're going to worry about that. But you see that after the peak of a country that democratizes at 0, it falls by about 15%. But actually in regression models, this is going to be a little larger, about 25%. All right. So let me, without further ado, jump into showing you a little bit more of how you might deal with this data, and I'll go step by step and talk about various issues of what's in the data, how you might sort of handle it, and then I'll come back to the substantive issues of what I think is going on in the data from an economic or political point of view. So let me sort of go beyond those two pictures that I showed you and estimate the simplest models that you can think about in a situation like this. So I'm going to have GDP per capita on the left-hand side in logs. It's going to be annual data. There's no reason for throwing away data, say, for example, averaging it to 5 years. And in fact, if you do averaging, you're going to create lots of problems with serially correlated data. So that's a really bad idea. And then you're dealing with annual data that's serially correlated, as these previous pictures showed. You really have to worry about lags. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put lags on the right-hand side, plus the alpha C is a set of country fixed effects, and delta T is a full set of time effects. And then the DCT is this dichotomous measure of democracy. As I indicated, I'm going to use this 0-1 measure, and it's collected from a variety of sources, and then we've hand-checked a lot of the data, but let me get into that given that time is short. But one important issue that I want to talk about is actually quite central and interesting. One thing you might worry about is that this democracy is a fiction. You know, at the end of the day, there are so many dimensions of what we call a democratic country. It has to have free elections. It has to have some sort of constraints on the executive, perhaps respect civil liberties, and so on. So here, what we have done is we've taken 4 components of democracy. Let me see which one is which. Oh yeah. So the first one is free elections. The bottom one is inclusive, so that no ethnic groups are excluded. The top one is constraint on the executive, and the bottom right one is civil liberties. And what you see is that actually when a country democratizes according to the 0-1 measures, all 4 of these things move very, very similarly. So in some sense, even though there are differences in the cross-section across countries that have, say, constraints on the executive and they don't have civil liberties, when you look at the about 200 cases of changes from 0 to 1 or 1 to 0 in the post-war sample that we have, whenever one dimension improves, all of them improve together. So even though democracy is, of course, much more complex than a dichotomous measure, for our purposes, there is quite a bit to understand from those dichotomous measures. So here is the sort of the first table focusing on GDP per capita. And as I said, the dependent variable is log GDP per capita. And what the first column does is that it runs this regression, but without controlling for the lags. So here, I pointed out 2 problems, if you remember when I showed the figure. One is that you're not using your time averaging the data, messing it up. The second one is that you may be getting the wrong answers if you don't worry about these serially correlated dynamics. So the first column does exactly that. It doesn't worry, it omits worrying about these serially correlated dynamics, and you find a whopping negative large effect, huge, -10, very imprecisely estimated. So clearly, things are all over the place. But the moment you put even the first lag of GDP per capita, things change. Now, instead of a -10 coefficient, you have a coefficient of about 1. And it's positive, the opposite of the first column, and fairly precisely estimated. Now, 1 lag in an annual data is not enough. Those dynamics that you saw were sort of rather complicated. Put 2, 3, 4 lags. That's what you do in the columns 3 and 4. The the estimates are becoming a little bit more precise, as you can see from the standard errors, and coefficient estimates a little bit smaller, around 0.7, but the qualitative picture is not changing. And column 4 is sort of a natural baseline estimate, and the number 0.7 says that once you democratize, the next year your GDP per capita is going to be higher by about 0.7% or percentage points. But that's not the permanent or long run or the dynamic effect of democracy. Why? Because once you increase GDP today, that's going to increase GDP tomorrow, and democracy is going to keep on having an effect on that. So if you sort of accumulate these, that's what the number at the bottom of the table is reporting. So the effect of democracy in the long run is about 21%. If you, instead of doing it long run, if you do after 25 years, it would be about just under 20%. And then column 5 says, okay, let's put even more lags of the GDP per capita on the right-hand side, so that you have 8 lags, and then that doesn't really change anything, and those lags don't matter. So it's a rather it's not a sort of a very simple time series for GDP per capita. It has these dynamics, but they're not so complex that you cannot capture what you need to capture with 4 lags. Now, this is all pretty pedestrian, it's pretty straightforward. There are lots of econometrics, and this is the time path of GDP per capita, and you can see here after 25 years where you are, although this clicker is not sort of showing up there. This is the scatter plot of the data, and you know, there are 2 reasons for showing you this. One of them is that you can see that this is not a relationship driven by outliers. That's a useful thing to do. But the second one is that you can also sort of trace your favorite country. So for example, here, South Korea is the one that I sort of picked up. South Korea democratized in 1988 in response to trade union and student protests, and as the US withdrew its support from the military regime in Korea, which was sort of imprisoning and killing the protesters a few years before, and so the regime collapsed, or quasi-collapsed. And now you see what happens in the Korea. The years before the democratization are the red years. The years after democratization are the orange years. And of course, there were some very high growth years during industrialization in South Korea. But overall, you see a fairly clear shift up in the Korean growth performance following democratization. Now, the same thing for child mortality. This is the first 5 columns of this table are the health equivalents of what I showed you for GDP. Again, if you don't worry about the dynamics, you're going to get meaningless answers shown by the red number there. In this case, it's not a positive, but it's not a positive. It's a 0. But the true effect, once you control for these lags, is a negative, and then the effects at the bottom after 25 years is about 23 to 20%. Now, one thing that you might worry about, and I think it's a very important thing, is whether there is a separate effect of democracy on prosperity and health. Could it be that what's going on to child mortality is just a mirror image of what's going on to GDP? Now, I cannot directly answer that by controlling for GDP on the right-hand side, because GDP is an endogenous variable. But given that the assumption here is that we can control for lags of GDP when we look at GDP itself, and child mortality when we are looking at child mortality, we can control for lags of GDP on the right-hand side, and that's what column 6 does, and you can see that it doesn't change things much. It's not a definitive answer to the question of what's the direct effect of democracy on health beyond its impact on GDP per capita, but at least it's sort of suggestive. So as I indicated, these are pretty sort of pedestrian regressions. They're the simplest cross-country within estimators. Now, this sort of serially correlated data, you can do a lot more fancy stuff with them, and we do a lot of that in our work, and I'm not going to bore you too much with it, except just flashing these results, showing you that more sophisticated econometric strategies for dealing with these various biases or serial correlation issues, such as using Arellano-Bond or Hahn-Hausman-Kirsteiner's procedures, they don't make much of a difference. And in fact, things are very insensitive to the exact dynamics, as long as you allow for some dynamics so that the data has this pattern that goes up and down, a little bit like in the first figure that I showed you. The effect of democracy is very clear, and that's what the last 4 columns of this table show, where we manually impose different degrees of persistence in the data, and they all give very similar results. Now we do, you can do a bunch of other things, but one I would like to just bring to your attention is to sort of separate democratizations and reversals. Could it be that perhaps what's special about democratizations is that there is some regime change and then it's like a Hawthorne effect? Any regime change is a good thing. Perhaps countries that are undergoing regime change are in the midst of some turbulence, and then regime change sort of resolves that turbulence. Well, if that's the case, there should be a marked asymmetry between the effects of democratizations and reversals in democracy. And in fact, that's not what we find. So here we separate democratizations and reversals. The two have pretty much the same effect with opposite sides. Whatever you gain when you transition to democracy, you lose it when you lose your democracy and go to an authoritarian, non-democratic regime. Now, there are millions of issues that you might worry about in terms of robustness. In particular, there are lots of possible confounders. There could be pre-existing trends, functions of various characteristics, and we try to go through many of those. But the real endogeneity issue I'm going to come back to, so those are more like controlling for confounders. Nothing on that set really has a major effect, so I'm not going to show you those. But instead, what I'm going to show you is to go beyond this sort of linear models for capturing dynamics and do something that's a little bit more non-parametric. So in particular, I'm going to show you, which is also very nice for another reason that I'll highlight in a second. You can sort of visually see the data, and you can also see the pre-trends in the data. So I'm going to adapt the procedure developed by Angrist, Jorda, and Kirsteiner. And essentially, it sort of mimics the causal effects, treatment effects setting, which is generally used on cross-sectional data, to a time series panel structure. And the key assumption is very similar to the implicit assumption that's used in a panel data setting. So it's the conditional independence assumption, which is the one shown up there. And it says that changes in GDP per capita are conditionally independent with respect to the orthogonal to democracy, conditional on the past lags of GDP. So that was essentially the spirit of the assumption of the linear model that I showed you. So, but now we do the same thing, and there are various different ways of doing this with linear regression, propensity score weighting. Let me sort of, since time is short, let me show you what is called sometimes doubly robust estimator, which adjusts the past changes, which does regression adjustment for past changes and then also does propensity score reweighting. And the reason why it's doubly robust is that even if your regression model is wrong, it gives you the right answer because of the propensity reweighting. So the nice thing here is this is really a very transparent procedure, so you can see the effects of democracy. It's a bit like the first figure that I showed you, except that just comparing democratizers to non-democracies, you're doing a more regression adjustment. But there is one nice feature here. In addition to seeing the effect very clearly, again, you see the 0 and you see the 20% there. So a 20% increase in GDP per capita in 20 years. But you can also see that this simple regression adjustment with propensity score reweighting actually gets rid of the pre-trend. So the pre-trend there was the reason why the raw data looked a little bit worrying, that democratizers were on a downward trend before democratizing. Now you're seeing that if you just condition on 4 lags of countries' own GDP per capita, it's taking care of that. So what's going on here? And what's going on is very simple. Essentially, countries don't democratize fully randomly. They get into economic troubles, and economic crisis is the handmaiden of democracy. When non-democracies have economic problems, that weakens them and it makes it more likely that they democratize. And what the propensity score reweighting and the controls are doing, and they're saying, well, even though you got into trouble, I want to make sure that I'm not comparing you to I'm comparing it to like countries, and that's what the sort of the regression adjustment is doing, and that's why it's getting rid of the pre-existing trends up there. Now, the same thing when you look at reversals, you see the same thing. It's a little bit less precise because there are half as many reversals in democracy as democratizations. And then finally, let me show you the same thing for child mortality. Again, you see there's no pre-trend. The controls on the basis of past changes have taken care of the pre-trends, but then after democratization, you see the fairly sharp decline in child mortality. Now, econometrically and substantively, the problem with these results, however, is that they're not really dealing with potential endogeneity. The concern that you might have, and perhaps I'll just try to explain it on this figure, is that, sure, we have gotten rid of the pre-existing sort of movements of democracies relative to non-democracies, but it doesn't mean that countries that democratize were somehow in a latent fashion on a trend towards higher GDP. And we're not really capturing the causal effect of democracy on future GDP per capita, but capturing the fact that countries that democratize are different and they were going to achieve higher GDP anyways. So the most natural way of dealing with that problem is try to sort of find an instrumental variable strategy that tries to get rid of that potential endogenous selection. All sorts of other things like the robustness exercises that I already reported, where you control for past GDP, other economic variables, are going to be somewhat imperfect. So there is one interesting candidate for that, we argue in our paper, which is democratization waves. If you look at this period of 40 years during which democracy went from 30% of countries to 60% of countries, it didn't happen in some sort of random fashion around the world. It took place in regional waves. This was first noted by Samuel Huntington and then several other political scientists. And essentially, part of this is that once one country democratizes in a particular region, that gives additional impetus for pro-democracy movements in neighboring countries. And neighboring here turns out to be, we've experimented with this quite a bit, not your neighbors, but countries that are part of the same region. So it doesn't really matter that Mexico is a neighbor of the United States. Mexico is part of the region of Latin American countries, and it behaves very similar to Latin American countries. So, and the number of regions you use is not very important. We use about 10 regions here, 9 regions. But so we then sort of look at the propensity of the countries to democratize in the region as a source of instrument. And so this is sort of the first stage of that. So where we are regressing each country's democracy index on the democracy wave variable in the region last year, the year before, again, 4 lags. And you can see that there's a fairly strong relationship. That the very bottom row, there's excluded instruments have an F statistics of 33, and the wave variables themselves are fairly significant, especially for the first 3 years. So the 4th lag is not that significant. Now, this instrument might worry you for a cousin of the reason that the endogeneity concern I mentioned might have already come to your mind, which is that, well, perhaps what's going on is that now the region itself is on an endogenous sort of trend. So that a region that starts democratizing perhaps was on a higher growth trend for other reasons. So even without the regional wave of democracy, the entire region would have become richer down the line. So in the remaining columns, that's what we try to deal with by controlling for various regional variables and spatial distributed lags of GDP so that the correlation structure is taken care of. So since time is short, let me not go too much into the sort of the details, but let me just show you the results again first for GDP, and then I'll show it for you for child mortality. So the first column is the sort of the IV analog of the OLS models, or the within estimator models that I showed you earlier on. And the nice thing here is that even though this is an entirely different source of variation, in fact, you can shut off this regional source of variation entirely when you do the sort of the earlier OLS type models. It doesn't change anything. You get pretty much exactly the same estimate. So now the effect of democracy after 25 years is 24% rather than 20%, but they're very, very close to it. And this is explicitly dealing with the endogeneity concern that I had mentioned, because the endogeneity concern is that I would have grown faster even if I had not democratized. But now the IV procedure is making sure that it's not my own democratization that we're exploiting, but the entire region's democratization. And then the remaining columns sort of control for all of these regional variables or pre-existing characteristics of the country. And the remarkable thing is that nothing changes much. The coefficient estimates are very, very stable, and the quantitative effects, hovers around 25%. Now, the same thing, if you do for log child mortality, you get very similar results with one notable exception. Now, one thing I like about the GDP results is that the quantitative magnitudes were very stable and very similar to the within estimator or the other more fancy GMM estimators that I sort of quickly showed. Here, the estimates, the quantitative magnitudes get larger than the 25% that you had, so are about twice or sometimes even a little bit more than larger than that. I don't really know what the reason for that is, but let me not say more because I don't know the answer. So let me end by showing two more things. The first one is, so far I've just focused on the data, and in the first sort of introductory remarks I mentioned lots of things that journalists and some social scientists have emphasized as potential drawbacks of democracy. But what are the mechanisms? What are the reasons why democracy might actually do well? And there are two reasons that I think are particularly salient in the literature. One of them is that non-democratic regimes are often in the pockets of some very narrow interests. And as a result of that, they distort various other dimensions of institutions in order to suit their core constituencies. And democracies, when they've come first and have the sort of the elbow room to do it, often change those specific economic institutional features. And the second is that democracies spend more. They're not as stingy as non-democracies. And in fact, that's exactly what you see in the data. So here are some mechanisms, and I'm just showing you the within estimates. In the next two slides, you see the IV, etc. They're pretty similar. Democracies are not more efficient. They invest a little bit more. But the real difference is democracies do a lot more reforms. So the third column is this index of economic reforms, and you robustly find that, contrary to what for a while institutions like the IMF believed and were very supportive of dictatorial regimes like Chile's Pinochet, democracies are actually better at undertaking market reforms because the non-democracies were the ones that really supported the beneficiaries' monopolies that benefited from these non-market institutions. And second, they have an immediate increase in tax revenues. They increase taxes, they cut tax exemptions, and they start spending more on health, education, and other things. So you saw the child mortality. The other two I'm showing you here are primary and secondary schooling. And these results are very robust also. And then the final thing I want to just mention, and then I'll conclude, is that if you are not a big fan of democracy, and I think, coming into this talk, I think having flat priors was a natural thing, because a lot of what you might have read would have been critical of democracy's economic influence. But one argument may still be at the back of your mind, which is that perhaps democracy is good for countries like France, but it's going to be terrible for Ghana or Botswana when you have a country at early stages of economic development. And in fact, that's also been claimed, people saying dictatorship, for example, Richard Posner, dictatorship will often be optimal for very poor countries. Or Glaser et al., more educated people are necessary to engage in civic activities, otherwise democracy is going to be inefficient. Well, is that true? So there's a very natural way of doing that, which is exactly the same estimates, but now interacted with various baseline characteristics. And the result is, A, there is absolutely no evidence that the stage of development matters. So countries at very different stages of development, when they democratize, on average, they have the same positive effect. There is some evidence that education matters. The higher is the education of a country, the bigger is the gain from democracy, but quantitatively it's a very small effect. So what that means is that even if you take the lowest education country in the sample, the effect of democracy is still positive. So therefore, let me conclude this, and the same thing is true for child mortality, by the way. Let me conclude by saying that I think one of the key things for features of institutional structure for countries is their democratic governance and participation. And for a long time, there has been a lot of focus on this in political economy and political science literatures. But the belief is that this is an interesting dimension, but it doesn't matter for economics, or if it matters for economics, it's a negative. And it's very sort of deep-rooted belief in many circles. But actually, when you look at the data, the opposite is the case, and the results are as robust as anything I've seen in the data. So I think probably for people with very, very strong priors, they will need more evidence, but I think it's time for us to start changing our minds about what democracy is doing for economic growth. Thank you.
Wow, what a talk. Thanks, thank you. It was really very stimulating. Well, we have about 10 minutes for questions here. If we have people in the audience who want to, can you hear me? Okay. We have about 10 minutes of questions for people, if people are of a mind to ask them. Are there microphones set up somewhere? The microphones are in the aisle? The microphones are in the aisle, so there's one. I spot one. It was hiding, and there's another one. So if you have a question, you could come up and ask it. And while we're waiting, maybe I'll kick off with a question myself. I kept coming up with questions, and then you kept answering them during the talk, which is sort of great frustration. But one thing that struck me, Daron, is that democracy is a really complicated thing, right? And these democratic shocks lots of things are changing in a society. And what is it about this change that's inducing this sort of rapid growth? And you addressed that a little bit. You say, well, look, we looked at, looks like they have better policies. It looks like they spend more. But you don't necessarily need a democracy to have better policies or to spend more. And is there something about the ideology or the norms or what is it about a democratic change that makes these channels more likely to happen, or are there other things democracies are simultaneously doing that help solve these problems?
No, I think that's a great question, and let me sort of give a two-layered answer to that. I mean, the first one is that I had read all of the literature when I started this project, so my priors were not very clear. I mean, theoretically, I expected democracy should have a positive effect, but I was expecting that this paper would end up like a paper that in the early 2000s, Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo wrote on inequality and growth, and they said, we just cannot learn anything from the data. It's just like, just the data is just too all over the place, and perhaps that's what I said we'll see, because there are just so many other things going on. At the end of the day, it just turns out that all of these other factors that are in the background, like finance, trade, unrest, etc., they don't change in a discontinuous manner. Democracy, 0-1, suddenly in 1 year you make this change and then the policies follow that. But you're absolutely right that there is no need for a country to change its democracy, to change its policies. It could do more investment in schooling and health. It could undertake better policies, dismantling some monopolies or inefficient regulations. And there are some exceptions that sort of conform to that. Like Singapore, I think, is a non-democratic country that, has over time improved some dimensions of its institutional setup, both on monopoly dimension, improving corruption and things like that. But it's like the exception that proves the rule, if anything. So I think in general, the reality is that non-democratic regimes, and I've lived in some of them, don't really find a great urge to improve things because that's not where their constituency lies.
All right, we have some questions here. Why don't we start over on the left?
Tony Scott, University of Melbourne. I wondered if there's any evidence on the effect of democracy on inequalities in income and health.
So that's a very interesting question. So we actually wrote 2 papers, Suresh, Pasquale, James, and I. One is the one that I've summarized here. The other one is on inequality. And what we found is that actually the effect of democracy on inequality is very complicated and it's not what we expected. We were expecting to see that in a democracy leads to lower inequality. And we do find evidence bolstering what I just said, which is that democracies tax more, they redistribute more. But overall inequality doesn't change all that much. And I think what's going on is twofold, and we find some evidence to suggest that both of these mechanisms are at work, but not very sort of precise. One is that a lot of the redistribution in democracy goes to the middle classes, and that has ambiguous effects on inequality. And second, I think is very well illustrated by the South Africa example. South Africa went from one of the most draconian non-democratic regimes to a fairly well-functioning democracy for at least until Jacob Zuma, starting in 1994. But what happened to inequality? Inequality exploded. One of the things that kept inequality in check in South Africa was that the 80+% blacks of the nation were totally excluded from all sorts of economic activity. So 80% of the country were essentially all equal. Now, after apartheid fell, the middle class, the black middle class, started enriching themselves, many of them through legitimate means, some of them not so through the illegitimate means. But now you have huge inequality within the black 80% of the population, so the overall inequality increases. So, non-democracies keep things in check. So once the market system starts flourishing, as what I was suggesting, that's going to have some inequality implications.
So thank you so much. That was a wonderful presentation. And I think you've answered the majority of my question, but it's a follow-up on the kind of economic reforms that get undertaken when democracy takes place. So is there a tendency for democracies to prefer or induce more of laissez-faire type, unleash the economic growth engine with large negative redistributional effects? Or is it that some democracies might result in more public reforms and increased, tax financing of health and education and other aspects of the economy? So do you see evidence of maybe these two competing trends, these two competing, a lot of times ideologically driven strands of policies and their effects on inequality?
Yeah, that's a great question. And unfortunately, I don't know is the answer. So one thing we know, and that's different from the economic reforms that I've mentioned, is taxation. So we know that democracies increase taxes and they increase spending. And that's very robust, and I'm very comfortable with that fact. And that's very different from the index of economic reforms. The index of economic reforms, which I just showed you here in this slide, is an index from the IMF. And they create that by putting together a whole host of different indices about market regulation, labor market reform, finance, capital markets, etc. And I think there just isn't enough. We haven't really looked at it in depth, to be honest, but my prior is that there isn't enough sort of variation in data to be able to pinpoint exactly which specific things that democracies are doing. And some of the things that democracies are doing are very much, you know, whatever is in vogue at the time. So many of these democracies liberalize the capital account. Now, in hindsight, perhaps there was too much liberalization of the capital account. Then that may not have been the driver of economic growth. But I think essentially what goes on oftentimes is that democratic governments come to power, they sort of take a whole sort of a rethink of whatever institutional features were in place, and then they liberalize some subset of them that are feasible to liberalize. But I think there could be probably more in-depth analysis with better data on that one.
I would say she went first, I got in line afterwards.
Thanks. Thank you very much for a very nice presentation. I was wondering if you considered the downward trend in the GDP before becoming a democracy and the upward trend in child mortality, whether you think that this may be related to countries that become democratic because of a war. So I don't know if you did some robustness check, leaving out countries that became democratic because of a war.
That's a good question. We haven't done that, but we have controlled on the right-hand side for sort of general instability. So the polity has a sort of a variable called sort of interregnum or something like that, which is just any collapse of government, and controlling for that doesn't change that, but we haven't sort of gone hand by hand and said these are affected by civil war, etc. So what you do see is that there is some increase in social unrest before democracies collapse, but controlling for social unrest does not change that pattern either. So my interpretation, and there is a paper that's totally distinct from ours, which sort of supports this, this presumption, is that, you know, it's the main causal channel going on there is that whenever a non-democratic country gets into economic trouble, that's when it starts becoming shakier. And the paper that I'm mentioning is a paper by Bruckner and Ciccone, and what they do is that they look at weather shocks in Africa, where Africa, you know, is the country where agriculture is most important, and when adverse weather shocks, so they're presumably exogenous, destabilize non-democratic countries and lead to their collapses and transitions to democracy. So that sort of supports that particular explanation.
Hi, great presentation, following a lot of your literature. I had a thought about if there was a consideration to think about the variable of democracy as perhaps being a little less binary, perhaps something like time since the last election, because we've seen more and more today countries that are democratic that are slipping away from being democratic, and that there seems to be a mechanism where they start to be less representative towards the entire country and more towards a certain smaller group of the electorate, as you said, and that you could probably see some similar links to there too, but also in where you have this definition of regime change, where you can see maybe a drastic shift, maybe within democratic governments too, from what used to be, I'm thinking more of the 90s, neoliberal circumstances to more populist ones now, or things like that, and how that sort of...
Yeah, so that's a very good question. I think there is a lot of richness there, and I don't think that richness, unfortunately, is captured by existing indices of democracy when you go finer. So pretty much everything I'm saying here is true at sort of the baseline level. If you do sort of polity or Freedom House or other continuous indices, but you're starting losing precision. And the reason why you start losing precision is because, you know, whether polity gives you a score of 7 or 8 or 9, there isn't much information in that. So, but I think the important thing, which is sort of implied by your question, is that this picture here, which I showed you, that these many different aspects of democracy are co-moving, that might well be a historical anachronism. That it's no longer going to be true if you look in the 21st century, where you have Viktor Orban, Erdogan, Duterte, that are democratic in the sense of free elections, but have totally removed all constraints on executive, violated civil liberties, and so on and so forth. So moving forward, perhaps things are going to be more complex and more room for more research.
Thank you. Our 10 minutes are up. You could ask Daron questions perhaps after the talk is over. We have, I guess, a few other things on the agenda. Thank you, Daron, for your talk.
So thank you, Jim, and thank you in particular, Daron, for a wonderful talk. A great way to end our Congress. As Jim says, we have a couple of items of business we'd like to go through before we say goodbye to you. We're going to present the Arrow Award, and I'd like to thank Chris Room for chairing the Arrow Award Committee. And as Chris comes up, we're going to play a clip from an interview that Bruce Hollingsworth did with Ken Arrow a while ago in celebration of Ken's life. Ken Arrow passed away earlier this year, as you may know. So we have a little video clip we're going to play as Chris is coming up on the stage.
So the idea of health as an insurable risk struck me as being completely obvious. There was didn't think about it. Obviously, you have something which is going to affect a few people very much, and not most people a moderate extent, and it was not predictable, at least not highly predictable. So it's actually an ideal example of insurance. And one of the questions was, why wasn't there more extensive insurance already? It's a pretty obvious question. I began to realize that there were these problems of incentives. And I began to read and grope. And one day it finally hit me. What was the really central feature here? And there were several different aspects. One was the relation between the insurers and the physicians or the insured. How do they know? How does the insurer know how much you really need? Put it in everyday terms. There was the obvious question that people have some idea of their health, and therefore they might, if you think you're likely to be sick, you'll insure yourself more. This was something which already occurs in life insurance, so it was not. And these concepts, I had heard about them: moral hazard and adverse selection were concepts that were already known in the insurance. I did not invent those words; they were borrowed from insurance literature, as I think I made clear. And then there was also the question: how do you realize it was a question of guaranteeing that you get good medical service when you get it? There's one of the incentives on the part of the physician to treat the patient properly. After all, by definition, the physician knows more than the patient. That's why he or she is the physician and you are the patient. Yes. That's intrinsic in the relationship. And how do you guarantee it? So, but it suddenly struck me, all of these, it just hit me one day after reading and pondering and starting to write a rather routine examination, trying to bring the modern theory of risk-bearing into the picture. It suddenly struck me, the point was there was a difference in information between the two parties involved. And this occurred, as I've just said, in several different levels. So the medical system was rife with this. All of these existed elsewhere, but this was probably more important in welfare terms than most of the other examples. I mean, you have a problem when you get your car repaired as to whether the mechanic does a good job and whether the mechanic finds faults which don't exist. And, so you have some parallels, but the magnitudes are simply not of the same order. So this gave rise to the idea this was a set of principles which had other applications, of course, but certainly came within full force into the health business and changed the nature of it very completely.
So it's a real honor and pleasure to have been involved in the Arrow Award, choosing the best health economics paper of the last year. The quality of the papers we're seeing in health economics is just enormously high. I mean, it's really amazing when you look at the set of the top papers nominated, and that's just, you know, a small set of the many out there. It's obviously also a fair bit of work doing this, and so I'd really like to thank the rest of the award committee. So that includes Luigi Siciliani, he was my co-chair, and then we have 15 top health economists. I'm not sure if their names are they listed there? I guess they're not. Well, oh, they are, great. So 15 people who put a lot of time in reading papers, evaluating them. They're the ones who did the real work. So I want to thank them. We're very proud this year of our winner. So this is a paper by Martin Gaynor, Carol Proper, and Stephen Seiler, Free to Choose, Reform, and Choice and Consideration Sets in the English National Health Service. This paper was published in the American Economic Review in 2016. It's a terrific paper that looks at what happened when there was a mandate to allow more choice in the British healthcare system. And so they were looking primarily at coronary artery bypass surgeries, and the effects on patient quality and also on hospital performance, and found that there were strong positive effects of the increased choice. So I'd like to congratulate the three of them. I know we have Carol here who's going to come up and receive the award and say a few words. So if we can give them our applause.
I want to say first that this is on behalf of all three authors of the paper, and that Stefan and Marty would have really liked to be here, and both of them tried hard, but both of them had family circumstances which intervened. So I'm talking on behalf of all three of us. This is very much a joint paper. And I'd just like to say our initial reaction was we were completely thrilled. It was completely unexpected. This is a field in which the quality, as Chris says, of the papers that are published now are so high. We had no idea that our paper was either being considered so winning it is just absolutely fantastic. And I would like to add to thank first of all Chris and Luigi and the rest of the committee, because I've been on this committee and I know how much hard work it is. So I'd just like to say, you know, we are absolutely over the moon about this. It's great, and thank you very much to everyone. And the final thing I'd like to say is to encourage some of the non-Americans in the audience. We write about a little island that, as I said on the other day, is sinking under the waves. There are opportunities for non-American health economists to really make your mark too with your countries. So I'd just like to encourage that and say thank you once again.
So now comes the moment in the proceedings when you get to hear where you're going to go next. I mean, not this afternoon, but in 2 years' time. So we're here at BU, and we're going to go to another BU. It's not this BU, it's Basel. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Stefan Felder, who's going to invite you to Basel.
Good afternoon. Choosing a conference motto is a somewhat tricky business. You do not want to be too narrow. At the same time, you need to catch people's attention. The Boston motto alludes to the city's past and its role in the American Revolution. In our case, we are referring to the Swiss mountains. The flyer features the famous Matterhorn above Zermatt, almost 4,500 meters or 15,000 feet above sea level. Quite ironically, at 244 meters or 800 feet, Basel marks the lowest spot in Switzerland. But I hope, of course, that we will present new heights in health economics in 2 years' time. Basel, located on the Rhine, is the Swiss gate to France and Germany. The conference will take place at the university and the university clinic nearby. The city center is a 5 minutes walk away. It is easy to get to Basel. From the airport, a bus will bring you in 20 minutes to the center. The airport is well connected with many other European airports. Alternatively, you can use the Zurich airport with direct train connections to Basel. Regarding the social events, we have not decided yet. We might have a reception offered by the city of Basel at the Antiken Museum, or we'll go to the Guild's restaurants in the city center. We have had discussion with Diana McIntyre and Andrew Wagstaff on the conference budget, and I'll discuss it tomorrow with the board once more. It looks like we might be able to lower the fees compared to this year, but we will see. Also, in the name of the other members of the local organizing committee, Thomas Sütsch and Peter Zweifel, who is here, I'm inviting you to come to the iHEA conference in 2019. I would like to conclude by presenting a short trailer about urban Basel, Switzerland. Thank you.
So I hope all your appetites are whetted, and we'll see you in Basel in 2 years' time. Before we go and deal with our more immediate appetites, there are just a couple of things I'd like to say by way of conclusion. First, I'd like to give a shout out to iHEA's next president, David Bishai. David, could you just stand up so if anyone doesn't know David, this is David. So David will take over in January. At this point, I'd like to just reiterate my thanks to the board, to the scientific committee, to the executive director, Di McIntyre, to managing matters, and above all to the local organizing committee. And Randy, thank you for stepping in at the last moment. Much appreciate your efforts. We've had a wonderful time here, a wonderful evening last evening, a memorable evening, in fact, with the piano playing from our star health economist pianist, and also to the staff who have helped here. The local team has been really fantastic. And last and absolutely not least, thank you, iHEA members, for coming. We've had 1,500 people here. It's been a great conference, and I really hope we'll see you all in Basel. So thank you and goodbye.